Good morning, and thank you very much for the nice invitation. With its 15th edition, the Documenta has fallen into a serious crisis. Anti-Semitism is a political problem. The current Documenta problem is not. There are indeed anti-Semitic motives, especially on the People's Justice banner, but these motives are covered by the freedom of art. In the context of art, every symbol is transformed into an item of interpretation. This should apply all the more to this huge patchwork picture. Nevertheless, 25 people and institutions have filed criminal charges against Documenta 15. The comment of the state prosecutor's office was as expected, quote, "There is no initial suspicion of prosecutable criminal offense." Jonathan Mese has already put it to the test with his Hitler salute and swastika performances. In Germany, Hitler salutes and swastikas are unconstitutional symbols and are explicitly prohibited by law. But you can use them in an artistic performance according to the court ruling. This means that in the context of art, even banned political symbols turn into a means of artistic expression. The problem of Documenta 15 is not a political problem, because in liberal democracies, politics is not allowed to regulate the use of symbols in art. That is why the Documenta problem cannot be solved with anti-Semitism clauses or codes of conduct, such as those recently proposed in Berlin and Kassel. Nevertheless, the Documenta cannot continue as before. So what is the problem that has plunged the Documenta into its existential crisis? My argument is that the Documenta as an institution has become so politicized that it has forfeited the privilege of freedom of art. It is precisely as it is perceived by society only as a political event, accordingly judged only by political criteria. Two factors are decisive here. There is an internal factor which lies in the evolution of modern art itself, and there is an external factor that can be counted among the many side effects of the digital revolution. Let's take a look at the internal factor first. Aesthetic modernity generates new art through a negation of old art, it is of art that already exists. In general, this logic of negation leads to a permanent inclusion of non-art into the art system. If one follows this logic in a radical and uncompromising way, one arrives at Documenta art. The genesis of Documenta art can then be traced in 4 steps. Modern art began in the 19th century with the negation of the aesthetic value of beauty, and correspondingly a negation of the fine arts. With its many isms, classical modern aesthetics was based on alternative aesthetic values, such as ambivalence and event, and the sublime in a purified form. In the next step, this classic modern art of pointillism, cubism, expressionism, and so on was outdone once again. In particular, conceptual art negated the general expectation that art is always aesthetic art and necessarily takes the form of an artwork. The possibilities of generating new art through the inclusion of non-art are not yet exhausted with ready-mades and analytical conceptual art. What has changed, however, is the meaning of non-art. Until now, non-art has been defined by characteristics of art that could be negated, such as the aesthetic material, the given genres, or even the expectation that art needs to manifest itself in the form of an artwork. In contrast, the post-war avant-garde attempted to cross the border between art and life. Here too, it is about specific negations, but not of established art, but of society as it is. Documenta art therefore tends to ally itself with political ideas. As a result, the Documenta is based on a concept of art according to which art is always and inherently political. For example, the curator of Documenta 14, Adam Cimcik, said in an interview, "Our exhibition may not have a political theme, but you could say that it thinks politically. There is political thinking behind practically every decision we have made in advance, and the selection of artists, with a few exceptions, is also politically motivated." The Documenta 15 can thus be understood as a culmination of an art concept that radically follows the logic of the avant-garde. On the one hand, it adheres to a brittle, concept-based, anesthetic avant-garde style, and on the other hand, progressiveness, which can no longer be achieved with internal artistic means, is now guaranteed by the attachment to progressive political movements. The Documenta 15 completely exhausted this logic of crossing boundaries and including non-art into the sphere of art, and thus also reached a 0 point. However, there is a big difference between the concept of political art of the historical avant-garde and the political art of the last two Documentas. With an artist like Joseph Beuys, the political claim was embedded in a complicated artistic aesthetic of social sculpture, from which no direct political instruction for action could be derived. Today's political art, by contrast, makes unmistakable political statements and shares the political agenda of activist movements. In many cases, political art and political activism are simply identical, so that the public can no longer perceive the difference between art and politics at all. But there's also a second external factor of politicization that has led the Documenta in the current crisis. The external factor not only affects the Documenta, but many institutions in liberal democracies, such as universities, theaters, cultural institutions, and even companies. I have developed a corresponding theory in my recently published book, Ideology Machines: How Cancel Culture Works. Its key hypothesis is that the digital revolution is triggering a general politicization of institutions in liberal democracies. This statement requires, of course, a minimal model of what an institution actually is. Institutions have a mission statement that defines their purpose. The purpose of a university, for example, is to provide education and to enable research. In this sense, the implicit mission statement of the Documenta is to present the most advanced state of contemporary art every 5 years. In addition, institutions have an administration. That administration distributes financial resources, personal resources, and symbolic capital to participants, such as students or artists, in accordance, and that is important, in accordance to their mission statement, that means in accordance to their purpose. Today, digital media transformation allows political activists to put much more moral and political pressure on administrations than in an analog media age. Feedback loops of political communication are emerging that trigger group polarization processes in that institutions. Psychology has shown that the members of a group that share the same political, the same moral or religious value take more extreme positions after a discussion than before a discussion. Nevertheless, even if all members of such a group share the same value, there will be a broad spectrum within the group itself, ranging from moderate to radical positions. The law of group polarization now states that the radical positions will prevail over the moderate positions. The mechanism that triggers such a group polarization is the expected reputational damage to the group members. Those who disagree with the radical positions seem to represent the value of the group only half-heartedly and are therefore quickly marginalized or even excluded from the group. The dissenting voices will quickly fall silent, the spectrum of opinion narrows and moves towards the radical voices that represent the group value most purely. Group polarization processes can be set in motion whenever there is a group with a common set of values. My argument is that in an analog media environment, such group polarization processes have so far been successfully contained and kept under control by the institutions. But that today, because of the new media, we can see what I call a digitally forced group polarization. As a result, mission statements are being politicized. More and more positions are being filled with political activists, and participants feel compelled to make political statements. Instead of knowledge, instead of education, and instead of art, such institutions are now beginning to produce ideology. They are turning, in short, into ideology machines. This is exactly what has happened to the last two documentas. Political values have almost completely displaced artistic values and transformed the exhibition into a political event. The current crisis of the Documenta can be explained by the fatal interplay of two factors. On the one hand, the Documenta maintains the image of an concept-based avant-garde, and on the other hand, it allies itself with political activism. But the inclusion of political movements in the art system is not the real problem. In a digital media age, however, this crossing of boundaries into political activism leads to a politicization of the art institutions themselves. And at this point, the Documenta becomes dysfunctional. It can no longer fulfill the purpose for which it was created. As a result, Documenta 16 is facing a crisis of legitimacy that could easily lead to it losing social and financial support and losing its symbolic capital. The fact that the selection committee has already resigned once is a clear indication that the Documenta has become a political football. The only promising option seems to me that the Documenta reinvents itself. What brings me to my last point. My recommendation to the new finding committee would be to emphasize the primacy of art over politics and to select the curator for the Documenta 16 according to this criterion. However, this would imply a far-reaching paradigm shift. Instead of continuing to follow the paradigm from the unity of art and politics, Documenta 16 would have to emphasize the difference between art and politics. This paradigm shift implies that one can no longer stick to the prevailing concept of Documenta art, according to which art is political in and of itself. Instead, you could now ask the question what political art actually is. Not all art that articulates a political theme is already political art. Art can also present a political topic in all its ambivalence, in all its dialectics, in all its tragedy and ridiculousness, and is therefore useless for political communication. My definition of political art would be that it is art that articulates a political conflict and additionally takes sides in this conflict. Even if one assumes this strict definition of political art, one cannot and must not ban such political art or censor such political artists in liberal democracies. That is why it is of crucial importance today to distinguish between political art and politicized art institutions. If artists and artworks are partisan, then the institutions bear, in my mind, a responsibility of confronting opposing political statements with one another and, for example, exhibiting pro-Palestinian and pro-Israeli art together. In times of strong political polarization, art best fulfills its function in liberal democracies when it also represents the polarization and does not merely take sides. Thank you very much.